All right, I think we're rocking and rolling in business. Hey, hello, this is Mr. Ippolito along with Mr. Hahn, and we're going to go ahead and very quickly take you through today's lesson in case you couldn't watch it or couldn't join us, or you just loved the lesson so much that you want to check it out again. So again, we talked about making good choices online. Just really quickly, a thing about due dates and announcements, Ed Puzzle. If you were having trouble with the Ed Puzzle, please look at the instructions in Infinite Campus. You can still get full credit. If you were having trouble, I went ahead and excused you. But if you would like to get full credit on that assignment, just check out the instructions in Infinite Campus. A quick word on the Inspiring American Women assignment that was due last night at 11:59 p.m. If you haven't yet turned it in, please turn it in as soon as possible because my Rio TV team Amazon editors, including the wonderful Ann Sebastian, they're going to be starting editing that soon, so we have it ready in time for Mother's Day weekend. And then just as you're listening to what we're teaching you today about the South, please think about how that compares with what you've already learned about the North, right? Geography, culture, technology, economy, all of that stuff. Be thinking about that. And then if you're all done with today's assignment and you want a little bit of a sneak preview into our lesson on slavery on Wednesday, you can go ahead and click there. We're not going to do that right now. We're going to go ahead and move forward. And Mr. Hahn, why don't you take us through the South?
All right, so we're going to be covering the South like we did for the North last week. We're covering certain things like geography, population, economy, stuff like that. Next slide, please, sir. Going to be some comparisons that we're going to be running here. First off, in geography, they had a lot of fertile soil in the South. Up in the North, they had that really rocky soil. It wasn't very good for farming. This fertile soil in the South was very rich. It was full of nutrients. So it was perfect for farming. They also had these mild winters in the South. It didn't really snow down there. It was generally an overall warm climate, so it allowed farmers to plant their crops year-round without stopping in the winter when it snowed. And then instead of these smaller family-run farms like they had in the North, they had these large plantations in the South, these large commercial farms where they wouldn't be growing crops to feed themselves or their families. They would be growing these crops on these large plantations to sell for at a profit. So, yeah, next slide, please, sir. I don't think do we need to go over these questions, sir? I don't think.
Well, just only to make students think about how these factors would help. We don't need to answer the questions, but
Sure.
a good question to think about.
So a good question to think about what was it? How would these geographical factors, the fertile soil, the mild winters, and these large plantations, how did they influence the way that the South would develop? Just a little bit to think about here. For more information to come. All right, so now we're going into the population of the South. So overall, the population in the South was smaller than that of the North. Remember that the majority of the European immigrants that were coming to the U.S. at the time were coming from Ireland, and they did not have that many skills in terms of work. And farming is a very hard and difficult. It takes a lot of skills to farm. You mess up one thing, you can ruin the whole harvest. So a lot of the unskilled jobs were in the North. So the Irish immigrants stayed up there in the North. Unlike the industrial North, unlike the industrial Northerners, the majority of the farmers, the Southerners, were small farmers or poor whites who worked on these small farms or plantations. A couple of bits of information here that are very important about the population of the South. Only 16% of the whites in the South owned slaves, and 32%, almost a third of the population of those living in the South, were slaves. So we're going to cover that more on these. We're going to be covering more on that with information to come. Next slide, please, sir. All right, so the economy in the South was controlled by the wealthy plantation owners, the small farmers, and the poor whites that I just talked about. They really had no say in it because they worked on their land. They didn't really make a profit from it. So these plantation owners, they would make a profit from their plantation, and they would invest it in where they saw fit. So therefore, they had control of the economy. And these wealthy plantation owners are primarily investing in two things: land, because you needed land to establish a plantation, and slaves, because they needed slaves to work on the land on their plantations. And so the land and slaves were the economic lifeblood of the Southern economy. But not only that, they also determine a Southerner's social status. If you own land and slaves, you're found to be higher on the Southern social class pyramid. And not only that, but then land and slaves gave Southerners a voice in politics. Voice in politics. They had political power by owning land and slaves. Yeah, so these wealthy Southerners, they were partaking in a system called capitalism. You may have heard of it. It's an economic system where these plantation owners would take the profits that they made and reinvest it into the plantation so they can make it bigger, longer lasting, and more profitable. Since they weren't really investing in technology at the time, in the South, they kind of had a big disadvantage when they decided to break away in 1860 during the Civil War. We're going to go into more on technology in the next slide. Some of the other investments that they made in the South, in economy-wise, were in the agriculture field. We had cotton. Some of the crops, some of the cash crops that they planted. We had cotton. That was the most popular one because there was a big demand for cotton from the clothing industry. People needed clothes. Next on the list, we had tobacco, rice, and sugarcane. Tobacco was the first cash crop in the United States before we were even the United States, back when we were colonies of Great Britain. And then, of course, some plantations they invested in, like livestock, the raising of cows, pigs, goats, other farm animals, or they invested in lumber, which is cutting down of trees for their wood to make into furniture or building materials. Now, one thing to note about all these all these items that we just listed, they're all raw materials, meaning that they had to be sent to a factory to be manufactured into a finished product. So that meant that these southern plantations, they were dependent on northern manufacturing or northern factories to buy their raw materials. That was the business system in place. The Southerners, they would grow the cotton or the tobacco, or they would harvest the lumber and they would ship it north, where it would be manufactured in a northern factory into a finished product. Next slide, please, sir. So we're on technology now. As we said earlier, technological development was not really a priority in the South. They were really standing behind, and they were doubling down and supporting plantation agriculture that was dependent on slavery. One reason they did that was because they knew it made them money. So why change anything if they knew if the system makes them money? But then there was one invention that did revolutionize Southern agriculture. It was the cotton gin. It mechanically separated. If you see the picture here, they throw the cotton in on one side of the machine. They turn the wheel, and it mechanically separates the seeds out of the harvested cotton at a much quicker and a more reliable rate than somebody doing it by hand. But the common misconception about the cotton gin was that although it did help the Southern agriculture, did revolutionize Southern agriculture, it was actually invented by a Northerner named Eli Whitney. So, like I said, technology wasn't really a strong suit of the South. This also ties into the industry of the South as well. They, in comparison to the North, which had factories on every block or on every floor of a building, the South, they only had a small number of mills and factories just spread out throughout the states. They weren't really investing in their own manufacturing capabilities just yet, and because of that, that would end up putting them at a disadvantage, like we said, when the Civil War started. Next slide, please, sir. Another question to think about from what we went over so far: what are three differences between the North and the South that we've learned? So three differences in terms of geography, in terms of economy, the population, the technology, between the North and the South. We've got some pictures here. It looks like a port. Looks like a port there with a bunch of ships, a factory there on the right. Down left, we have one of the very few images of a southern port. And then at the bottom right, we have a typical plantation down in the southern United States. Next slide, please, sir. All right, and then next we got transportation. Similar to technology, the South wasn't really willing to invest in transportation infrastructure as well. What I mean by infrastructure, I mean like roads, ports, railroads, canals, and stuff like that. Like the North had really developed those. But in the South, there were very few railroads. If you remember that video that we saw last week showing the expansion of the railroad from the 1830s to the 1850s, you'll notice that a lot of the expansion was mostly in the North. By the time that the North had a railroad that cut all the way across New York State to the west, there was only one railroad. There were like two railroads in the South in general, one in Virginia and one in South Carolina. Same difference between the waterways and the canals. There were very few connecting waterways and canals in the South. And this is tied in mostly with the politics at the time. A lot of the northern states, they were under they were aligned with the Whig Party, which believed in taxing their citizens more, but then they would use those taxes to improve the roads, the railroads, the canals, all the infrastructure up in the north. But then in the South, where they were they Democratic, sir? Were they Democratic at the time, or were they something else? I completely forget.
Oh, the South during this time would have been dominated by the Democratic Party for
Yes, yes.
sure.
Okay, so I was right. So these Southern Democrats, they were more of the type where they were they left their people alone. It was more states' rights. They collected less taxes, and so they were yeah. So they decided at that point it was more of a they were more independent in terms of, oh geez, what's the word I'm trying to say here? Yeah, they were more independent in terms of taxing their people taxing their people. So they were not looking to invest in their infrastructure at all. That ties into, remember, the Henry Clay's American system as well. So moving on, we got the ports. You remember in the North, they had a lot of these major port cities like New York and Philadelphia and Boston. These cities were major shipping hubs in the North. In the South, they really didn't have these major port cities. They only had a few. A couple of examples here would be like Charleston in South Carolina and New Orleans down in Louisiana. And then, of course, there were some the roads in the South because they were unwilling to invest in the infrastructure of the South. The roads there were in very poor condition. Lots of if it rained there, it just mudded over, and wagons and people would just end up getting stuck, and it was just not a good time. I think that's it for transportation, sir. And I think this is all you, sir, in terms of culture.
All righty. Hey. Okay. So quick word on culture. So the culture of the South, it's going to be much more of what we call a genteel society. Not gentle, but genteel, right? Has the same root word as gentleman. You are refined. You are sophisticated. You're a man of honor, right? Very similar to the chivalry, the code of chivalry in medieval Europe. Education was only for the elite, so you could only there was no public education like there was up in the North. A big push, as you remember from last week's lesson on the Northern Reform movements, a big push in the North for all children to be educated. In the South, certainly they did want to educate African Americans. It was against the law for slaves to read and write in the South. So, but even poor whites were not getting educated either. Education was only for you could have private school or a private tutor just for the wealthy children, basically. Much more rigid class system. We're going to show you that in just a moment. Slavery and slave codes. We're going to talk about the strict rules that governed slaves in our next lesson. Widespread communities, meaning people were more spread out. They lived farther away. In the South, pre-Civil War South, they were doing social distancing before it was even popular. And then finally, far fewer, excuse me, let me back up. There was far less religious diversity in the South than there was in the North. In the North, all sorts of Christian denominations, probably hundreds of Christian denominations, different kinds of Christian churches. Also, people of the Jewish faith and even some Muslims living in the North, during this time. Small populations, but still there. In the South, though, mostly Anglicans and Baptists, which of course were Protestants living in the South. So much more religiously homogeneous in the South as opposed to the North. And then finally, we want to talk about that Southern class pyramid, this rigid social structure that really governed the South during this time. So at the very top, you have that planter elite. 8% approximately of the population of the South were the wealthy planter class, these plantation owners that got their wealth from large farming, right? Cash crop farming. Next up, you have small farmers. When we say small farmers, we don't mean like small humans. We mean farmers who had small farms, right? So they might own one or two slaves, but the majority of the work that was done on these small farms was done by the family, sometimes in conjunction with their slaves, right? So these families, these small farmers, they would work side by side. So generally, slaves on small farms were treated better, not to excuse the practice of slavery at all, but they would be treated better than treatment on plantations where there might be, dozens or hundreds of slaves. This biggest section right in the middle, this is poor whites. So the majority of whites living in the South were poor whites. They did not own land. They certainly did not own slaves. They were mostly tenant farmers. They lived on land that was owned by somebody else, so they rented the land that they lived on. And so it was mostly kind of subsistence farming. and the crops that they were growing, they really belonged to someone else. So either that, or they lived out on their, or they did not live necessarily on a plantation, or they were just kind of living out in the, the backcountry areas of the American South. This next kind of narrow sliver right here, free African Americans, this is going to make up 2%. They were primarily craftsmen, merchants, traders. They're going to live mostly in larger cities of the South. That was safer for free African Americans. I know it's counterintuitive to think, wow, there were like actually free blacks in the South before the Civil War. Yes, there were, but again, they're going to live in like Richmond, Virginia, or Baltimore, Maryland. It was safer to live in the large cities than it was for a free African American to live kind of out in the rural areas where they could potentially be enslaved. So that was only 2% of the population. And then finally, you have the enslaved African American population, which was nearly a third of the population of the American South during this time. All right. So the question I asked was, what does this remind you of from 7th grade history? And the answer we got over and over again was the medieval class pyramid. If you guessed that, then you guessed correctly, because again, you see those similarities between up at the top, you have the planter elite, whereas back in medieval Europe, you'd have the king and the royalty. The nobility up at the top here, they were making money. Again, another similarity is they were both agriculture-based economies. And so they were making money primarily from farming. Down here at the bottom in medieval Europe, you had the peasants and serfs, whereas in the pre-Civil War South, you had the African-American slaves. Both of them were kind of bound to the land. And then another similarity we pointed out was this layer right here. They were merchants, farmers, tradesmen, and craftsmen. And then some of the poor whites and these free African Americans were also merchants, craftsmen. They were making things with their hands. Again, there were no factories, very few factories in the South. So most of those manufactured goods, if they're making them in the South, they're making them by hand. So if they're making machines, tools, they're making horseshoes, blacksmiths, craftsmen making clothing by hand, then that would be kind of that section. So this combination of some poor whites here, along with these free African Americans, they would be doing that. Okay, so now let's go ahead and jump right into this. What are you actually doing? What is the assignment for today? Here it is. So again, you need to be thinking about the North that we've already learned about last week, the West, which we learned about in our Manifest Destiny unit, and now we just learned today about the South. So today's assignment, you're basically going to do a 1-paragraph essay. The topic is time travel through history. Imagine that you today are sent by time machine 170 years back in time to the year 1850. Based on the information that you've learned about the West, the South, and now the North, which region of the United States would you prefer to live in and why? You're going to answer the prompt in a paragraph. You're going to state at least 3 reasons why and use one piece of evidence from previous lessons or the lesson that you just learned today to support each reason. The rubric is in Google Classroom. Now, I'm going to show you Google Classroom in just a moment. There's also a video right here. If you're not sure how to write a great 1-paragraph essay, I posted that on YouTube earlier this morning. Mr. Hahn, let's go ahead and take them really quickly over to the Google Classroom assignment. Time travel through history, it's right here. If you click here, this is not something you edit. You're going to create your own Google Doc and attach it to this assignment. But here's an example paragraph right here that if I click correctly, then it's going to take us to this example paragraph. Oh, these are both loading here. So eventually loading. And so this is an example that I'm about to show you. There we go. Okay. So please notice that I am not using the North, the South, and the West because I don't want to push you in. I don't want to influence you in any one direction. So I went ahead and chose a similar structure, but a different topic. So if you could live in the Marvel universe, the Star Wars universe, or the Harry Potter universe, which universe would you choose and why? And so you'll notice here my topic sentence or my thesis statement. This is the very first sentence right here. I would choose the Harry Potter universe. And then I'm going to give 3 different reasons. So living in the Marvel universe, simply too disruptive and heartbreaking. And then I give evidence for that. And then I give another reason. I wouldn't want to live in the Star Wars universe because there's too much authoritarian rule. And then I'm going to back up that statement with evidence, and you can see the evidence right there. And then finally, I say the Harry Potter universe is best because there's magic, right? And so I give my final reason as to why I'm choosing the Harry Potter universe over Marvel or Star Wars. And then I just provide one sentence. If you want to provide more, you can, of evidence right here. And then I tie it all up by restating my thesis at the very end because I put a nice little concluding sentence on there. You don't have to. You can if you want. I like it. It's up to you. So you'll see, because I've had students ask Mr. Ippolito, how many sentences do we need exactly? Well, I think we determined that the minimum number of sentences, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So I think in order to have a good, solid one paragraph essay that meets all of these requirements, you're going to need a minimum of 7 sentences. So that example is in here. And then if you would like to listen to me in just over 3 minutes, go over that in a little bit more detail, then you can also watch this YouTube video right here, how to write a great one paragraph essay. Okay, Mr. Hahn, is there anything else that we need to mention before we sign off for this recording?
I don't think so, sir. Other than what was it? The due date for the the time machine assignment is going to be this Friday. So take your time with it, get it right, and I think it's just a good time.
Very good. All right. So, hey, that's your assignment for today. Hope you enjoyed the lesson on the South. Hope you've been thinking a lot about how the North is different from the South, because ultimately, when we get to the Civil War, we got to figure out how and why did these two societies become so different from each other, so far apart from each other that they were literally willing to kill each other in the Civil War, which was a war that killed more Americans than all other American wars and military engagements combined. So we got to try to figure that out, and hopefully we're helping to answer this question as we make progress toward ultimately toward getting to the Civil War. All right, Mr. Hahn, if there's nothing else for you, there's nothing else from me. You're good?
Nothing from me. Yep.
I'm good. Okay, folks, thank you so much, and have a great day. And we